Hello and welcome back to Parley, the series where I improvisationally respond to your prompts. And this one is from Liquid. I hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about low definition horror versus high definition horror, like high resolution, high image quality horror games. Is low definition horror more effective than high definition horror? That might be a very subjective question by definition, but it's been hanging on my mind lately, Liquid says. What prompted this train of thought was a recent indie release called Look Outside. It's an Earthbound-ish role-playing game with a Lovecraft-light kind of plot, predictably filled to the brim with body horror, grim deaths, and apocalypse endings galore. And despite the fact that I'm usually not drawn to horror, it's fascinated me as a product. Watching it all the way through, I've kept thinking to myself, I'm not fazed at all by the horror in Resident Evil, Dead Space, or Silent Hill, but these retro titles like Fear and Hunger, Sweet Home, the spiritual predecessor to Resident Evil, and now this game, Look Outside, positively scare me by comparison. What do these titles with their simpler presentations have, and or do, that big budget productions with realistic visuals don't? What a cool parlay prompt. Sure. This is an interesting one for me because I feel like I sort of know, but also there is really no way to know. And so I'm going to do a lot of speculating, but I also have things that I feel like are likely to be some of the answer. I guess let's say it that way. Sure, I can think of a lot of things it could be. So let's just say some I feel more confident about first, and then speculate baselessly after that. Sounds like a plan. Maybe the simplest outline for a parlay I've done in a while. I think the most straightforward mechanic going on here is that it's harder to make out what's going on. Because it's less clear what you're seeing on the screen, it's scary in a way it isn't because it's less clear. Fear stems largely from the unknown. When people are afraid of something or anxious about something, I think it's very useful as a person to acknowledge that these things are ultimately eliminatable lacks of knowledge. You know, you don't have to be anxious about something. If you're anxious about something, in theory, some information or actions would relieve the anxiety. You're not forced to be anxious about that forever. It is not only natural in any way that matters, to be anxious about something. Same thing with fear. Fear is a natural, ew, feeling, gross, but can be eliminated with knowledge. It doesn't mean you'll never be afraid of anything else. Your frontier of knowledge, and therefore what you're afraid of, will move when you learn new things. And it can be an anxiety reaction in and of itself to try to cull fear from every moment of one's life. But at the same time, I think it's pretty clear that fear is something you can eliminate. Knowledge is, or lack of knowledge, is the source of fear. Most of the time, anyway, I think it's that simple. And therefore, when you watch a horror movie on a beautiful flat screen modern television, that same horror movie could be made much scarier if you watch it on some piece of crap CRT thing, an older television. It could be scary just because the image quality is janky. It's less clear what's going on. You don't have the safety of basically turning on the lights. Just like how if a monster invaded your home and it was daylight, that can be scary in its own way, seeing it in all its grotesque horror. But there's a way in which that's just shocking, and it's not scary in the same way. I think the most straightforward answer here is when games have better graphical fidelity, it's easier to see what the game is. And that is inherently less scary because it creates less fear of the unknown. The kind of second thing that came to mind was that they are less scary on purpose. And that's an interesting diversion point because that first point I just made, well, you could say, but that's a little weird. Don't people who make horror know that fear comes from the unknown? I think they definitely do. So if people are trying to make a game that is scary, why do they ever make it have a lot of graphical fidelity? Of course, it's not that simple. And we can get a little bit into dissecting fear in a little while. Things being realistic is scary in a way that things being unrealistic isn't, because them being realistic looking makes you recall the idea that they could be in our reality. It brings to mind that they might be right around the corner here. They look like they're from our world, not from a video game world. So I guess the immersion and the fear of the unknown, because the image quality isn't as clear, are sort of in competition a little bit. Certainly, you could make a game with very detailed visuals and which made those visuals relatively unclear on purpose, and some existing horror games seem to me to do that. I'll just say as a disclaimer, as we get into the weeds a little bit here, that I am no great lover of the horror genre. I consider it to be a bit gimmicky, personally, and that's perhaps why I have so many things ready to say to criticize it. But it's deeply interesting as well, and I think that horror to me is one of those things where I'd more take issue with it as a bit of a genre rather than that I think it's like silly for horror to be in things. I don't think that's like bad. If you're enjoying it, that's also great, by the way. Just that I'm not sure it's enough of an offering for me when I, go see a movie, for example. I just find that a bit like one note, I guess, whether the horror succeeds or not. Now, that being said, this brings us to my claim. I think a lot of games are not as scary on purpose. Because, again, I think a lot of people who make horror know what I said about horror being from the unknown, know that things can be scarier when they're on a janky TV or whatever, and are chasing graphical fidelity, and immersion can increase how scary something is, and you can make something realistic looking and obscure how well the audience can see it. So then why might some games not do that? I feel like there are a lot of games that kind of don't do that. A really good example that I don't know that much about, but I'm aware that in the horror genre, or whatever you would call this genre, this would be a common example, is, I think it's Silent Hill, the game with the fog. There's this intense fog cast over the environment in, I think Silent Hill is the game, the original Silent Hill. Now, there's this interesting situation with this game where that fog was created partly as a way to cover up the limited draw distance as you're walking through the environment. The game doesn't have enough processing power, the console the game is on doesn't have enough processing power to render a bunch of stuff in the environment, so they literally just hit it with fog. This resulted in making the game scarier in some way, that fear of the unknown thing again. But I have a question to begin this line of reasoning. Which came first, though? The chicken or the egg here? Did they put in the fog and then that was a good solution, for the draw distance, the lack of processing power? Or did they look for a solution for the processing power and find the fog? Now, just quickly, this is a type of question that people tend to say, oh, in an interview they said this. Not to be rude, it doesn't matter, I don't care. I'm just saying, thinking about that for a second. I don't know if the people who made that would have been able to thoroughly document that. I even if they say, I know for sure it was like this, I still think it's worth asking and saying, well, okay, that's what you would report about it. But basically what I'm suggesting is that, to me, that sounds like the game was scary or mysterious in the way that it was due to an emergent result of game design, not because they planned from the start for the game to be like that. That's what I think. To me, it is not really relevant whether they would say that is or is not what happened. I still think that is a thing that happens often in game design. Okay, fast forward to the future. Those graphical limitations are largely obliterated nowadays. So more of what is in games is done like not on purpose as much as they can do whatever they want. Nothing will stop them from doing it the way they want to do it, except the budget, I guess. But even then, increasingly, not even that. And so games don't need to consider reducing their graphical fidelity. When I say that games are maybe less scary on purpose, the first thing I mean by that is that maybe without those limitations, the creativity is not bred. Therefore, it's been revealed all along that these developers would have made a game that didn't run into any speed bumps and therefore isn't scary in the same way, if they didn't have any limitations. But those limitations in the past caused games to be scarier. Now, looking at the indie scene, we have to interpret that a little bit. The technology is still from 2025, when I'm recording this, but they have less development resources, right? And so maybe some of that is coming back. Those limitations, not the exact same limitations, are again breeding creativity. What I'm suggesting here is a little cynical. Yes, they're doing it the way they're doing it on purpose in a lot of modern high definition, high graphical fidelity games, but what they would do on purpose with no interference just isn't as good as what they would do if something interfered with them. I'm arguing, in other words, that many of the games that are really scary are actually not scary on purpose as per se. They kind of just ended up that way due to limitations. The people who made the game can be commended for being inspired to make a game that is scary or mysterious or interesting to look at. But I'm not sure that I agree that in many cases, those people actually deliberately manually made the game good that way. That is, I think a lot of developers in history don't actually know why, or didn't know why, as they were making their game, what was going to make the game good. Certainly, a lot of them did. I'm not trying to be super cynical or anything. I actually don't think this is that hot of a take. I just feel like people really overestimate how much games that are considered masterpieces were formed out of whole cloth. I think many of them know they ended up that way. And another thing I want to draw your attention to is the selection bias aspect. We know of the games where the process ended up making something, scary in this case. We don't see all the times that the developer, again, went through a process of trying to make a game spooky or whatever, but it just kind of didn't turn out. If you could see all those failures, you would be much easier to convince that some of the successes are kind of accidents, a little bit. I'm not saying the people that made it have no talent. Again, they were able to use those limitations to breed creativity. That is a skill. That's not like, that doesn't like not count. There's not necessarily something so noble about it one way or another. Just that I wonder if a lot of games in the past had it easier in that they simply had to do it one way. And so eventually, one of the games made with those limitations had to do it a way that could be scary. Nowadays, you can do it whatever way you want. You won't be limited, and thus you need to bring the creative idea yourself. And it turns out that's harder, I guess is what I'm suggesting. I think that it is, and that having systems in your life to make something like on purpose, manually, exactly the way you have it in mind, good, is much, much harder than just doing what you would do and hoping for the best. Now, again, there's nothing necessarily more noble about that. If you and I race game design and I try to do things by mega-minding it to be this exact way that I want it to be, and you just make as many games as possible and think on your feet, I bet you'll result in more good games, at least for a while. It will take me a while to hone the ability to have a good system or formula for consistently making things fully on purpose, not forced to be a certain way, not inspired by other games as well. New manually created things that are consistently good. That's hard to do. I'm suggesting that horror is a genre that is very affected by this phenomenon. Certainly, I think a lot of other games are too. For example, something kind of weird when we talk about build systems in games, as I'm wont to do, you might have heard, is that a confusingly small number of games have good ones. And a lot of the time there are still weird little edges. I'm troubled by the thought that maybe basically none of them were manually made to be good. Or even worse, that manually trying to make them good actually makes them turn out worse than if you just roll with the punches and try to bootstrap or adapt them to be good. But again, I would argue that these are things that we can move past with knowledge. If all of this is true, I would suggest that over the next 10 or 20 years, what we would see is that horror games would become scarier on average, if this is the phenomenon that's going on, because people will learn over time to systematize what makes things scary and basically learn and create theories of doing it on purpose that are more consistent. games will be less defined by a limitation, and then they found a way to make it work, and that ended up being good some of the time, and then those games succeed, and will be more the people that have a system by which they can calculate it to be good will hopefully receive the acclaim that I think warrants. That's a valuable and challenging skill to cultivate. So that's thing number two. Maybe they're less scary because developers are able to do whatever they want in the game, and it turns out it's much harder to make something scary if you don't have any limitations or less limitations. Second part, though, of they're less scary on purpose. Maybe a lot of the AAA industry, which tends to have higher definition graphics, is making games less scary on purpose in a different sense, like they intend for the market for the game to be less scary. That is, they're targeting an audience that they believe, I think they're right, wants less scary games. They want a Twitch streamer who's going to play a horror, I'm not trying to be pejorative, just that I think it's something meaningfully different now, game that isn't really that scary. It's not impractical to watch with a crowd or watch casually. Why people want to casually have some video game on while they're going about their life, I believe is outside the scope of this parlay, but, without much commentary. I won't pretend to be an expert on such a thing. I like my streams, and I think a lot of people like my streams because I talk during them, and we have interesting discussions, and there's stuff to say about the games. Certainly, my streams always do better when there's gameplay on the screen, but I'm not sure the people that it is doing better for are the people that like the stream the most, as much as it is like TV with a personality that people enjoy. That's flattering, but I just think that isn't a super high bar. It's not that hard to do that. And a lot of people do that. A lot of people want that to be done. And I think that they, for whatever reason, that I don't pretend to understand, people kind of want that in every genre. And so a lot of games, I think, are being made purposefully to be unscary, but have these sort of trappings of being scary. It reminds me a little bit of when you go buy coffee at the grocery store. There's all these different coffees, and it's commodity grade coffee. The differences between the different coffees are not very pronounced because it's not very high quality coffee. And the customers buying it are the people that are less experienced tasting through coffees. They often buy better quality coffee that more pronounce those flavors if that's what they wanted. So why are there so many choices? They're not really that different. If you've ever done a comparative tasting of commodity grade coffee, it's fascinating. They're certainly different, but I mean, only if you really set aside some time to focus and have a painstakingly constructed comparative tasting, and have some experience tasting into things, and have a reasonably sensitive sense of taste. The people that are buying these coffees most of the time are not experiencing a meaningful difference in taste between them. I don't feel. Now, the placebo effect is a real thing. That's not bad. If you buy one of these coffees, it tells you flavor notes, you expect it to taste a certain way, and then you experience a flavor sensation because the coffee prompted you to, even though it isn't chemically coming from the coffee you bought. So what? That's efficient. Good. You got some free flavor. You hallucinated some flavor into the coffee. Or you could say the coffee provided a benefit as a product, which is that it prompted you to hallucinate some flavor into it. But it's still odd, right? Like that activity is a little strange. Like the purpose isn't really for them to be different, but for them to seem different. And I would argue that something vaguely similar is going on with people liking genres of game. I propose that people do not like genres of game. They like to feel like they have a thing that is their preference for a genre of game. And that in reality, for example, like, I don't remember which Resident Evil remake because horror is the genre I know the least about in video games. But a recent one of them. I mean, it was an action game. You know, brother is just knocking down zombies with a spare board like a boss. I don't think it was focused on being scary from what I was watching of the gameplay. Or was it a Silent Hill remake? I don't remember. If you play this kind of game, you probably know what I'm talking about. It didn't seem to be interested in being scary. I'm not saying that it was or wasn't. I don't know or care. but that it didn't seem like the game design was trying to be that much focused on being scary. It seemed like the game design was trying to be like other games, but then it just says it's a horror game. Again, it recalls this wall of commodity grade coffees that are supposedly so different, even though they're all really darkly roasted, which makes it very hard to begin with to tell between them, and I'm not sure they were so different to begin with. What is the point of this? I think there is a point to it, but is that in pursuit of them being scary? No, I don't think. On the other hand, indie games as a genre, it's not really a genre, but as an institution, are often going to be able to focus more on the raw quality of the game, not its kind of market positioning. By all means, there are lots of indie games that are trying to fit into a certain market niche, but it's also really common that these games, which will have more involved fans, much lower development budgets, but then also less overall units sold, are going to be able to shoot for the game is just extremely good and can be marketed through word of mouth, rather than the game is a market-tested, targeted product that will sell to this demographic because we know that they want a game like this, if that makes sense. Those games are going to tend less to try to be like other games with no further edits. You know, it doesn't really make sense to try to challenge a multiplayer competitive first-person shooter like Call of Duty, let's say, by making your own indie Call of Duty, where the goal is to make it as milquetoast and crowd-pleasing as possible, and to have good graphics and good shooting mechanics, and you just have way less resources than the AAA studios. It doesn't seem like a very good bet to bet on the indie studio when making such a thing. And so a lot of the time, they're going to make something that is more about its game essence. I think many indie games are more about being a video game than many AAA games. And the reason is that they can afford to, you could say. If you're going to spend a huge amount of money on a game's budget, well, it's got to appeal to the market more broadly. So that's the kind of second part. To recap, the three things that I'm fairly confident are some of the reasons. That is, I think most people making horror games know all of these things, and they are thinking them when they make these games. Would be one, horror comes from fear of the unknown, and increasing graphical fidelity with no other changes will tend to make something less scary, I think, like turning on the lights or putting on your glasses if your eyesight isn't perfect when there's something scary around you. This is what increasing graphics without changing anything else will do to an extent. Two, I think that a lot of games are not chasing being scary in the same way. They were previously made where the developer did what they could and tried to adapt when they hit a limitation, and it turns out, I propose, that often makes games better or scarier more easily than if you ask a developer to do everything from the ground up. There are no surprises, everything comes out exactly as you envision it. Learning as you go has been kind of removed a little, and it is a harder thing to do to make a game good if you have that experience. And three, I think a lot of games are purposefully less scary to appeal to a certain part of the market, not just Twitch streamers streaming the game on Twitch. Obviously, I wasn't suggesting that. Just as an example, that there certainly are a lot of people that want or think they want this type of game. And I don't think that they want the same thing as a game that is scary. I think a lot of people know about point one, that when you make things clearer, they can become less scary. And you could make a game with very clear graphics that makes those graphics obscured in some way. Yet I think a lot of games kind of clearly don't do that, and yet say they're in the horror genre to an extent or market that way. Why would they do this? Well, perhaps their marketing team knows something we don't because they sell very well. Who knows, you know? And the market is also sort of broken. You know, I guess as a transition point, it's always important to remember that just because a thing is purchased a lot, especially a complicated hobby like a video game, does not mean that people actually want it more than other things. It means they think they want it more than other things. It means the world is collapsing and we're in the middle of some actual war and some trade war and some everything. I think most of you probably don't need to be recapped on this. It's crazy, and people don't have time to dissect exactly what thing they're doing with their hobby. So of course they're going to buy the thing that is in the general category they think they like with the limited time they've had to explore that, and then it will be a hit or a miss. The copy has already been sold. It takes a long time for the general market that doesn't have time to analyze through this to change their preferences and learn, oh, AAA kind of sucks now most of the time. But and that's been true for like 10 years, but it takes a long time for that to kind of shift. It's a big vessel. A lot of people in the world that are in that bucket. So I do also want to say that the marketing team might know something we don't, or it might be this sort of inertia, let's call it, of the market, that people sort of think they want this, but they haven't gotten fed up yet enough with the fact that all of this kind of horror game isn't really what they're looking for from a horror title. Or it might be that they've discovered that they actually like that more, and the market shifting has kind of exposed them to a new thing they wanted, more like an adventure game rather than strictly a horror focused experience. It's conceivable that a lot of people who think they like this actually like that, and then if the market is just kind of weird and going off in a different direction, they might just accidentally realize while trying to get this, getting that they actually like that, it turns out. Who knows? Could be any number of things, but I don't think that means that people actually want that thing necessarily. I think it would be arrogant to believe that we know that one way or another. I bet if you ask the marketing team for these games, they will say that their data shows that they know that, and I am going to say that I think they don't know that. I don't think we can ever know that, really, but we can speculate. There's something weird going on with what people want from that thing in the market. Perhaps. Okay. Bad idea time. Perhaps. Let's take a different tactic on the limitations breed creativity thing. Maybe a lot of the scary things were mistakes, not limitations, and then the developer came up with something clever, but the developer simply failed to implement something the way they intended, but the failed implementation is scarier than it would otherwise have been. Bugs can sometimes be quite scary at times. There's a pretty famous screenshot from one of the Assassin's Creeds where there's a meaningful scene and one of the characters' skin on their face simply disappears, revealing their horrifying eyeballs and like teeth, and it's pretty scary, and I don't think it was intended to be scary in that way, but that's just a meme example. You can imagine how things could be a lot scarier potentially if certain things break at the right time and in the right way. And so one version of that earlier point is, yeah, it can be easier to learn as you go by working within limitations and then thinking on your feet, and then you end up basically gaining experience as you go. Most game designers, most game developers are very inexperienced because it's almost impossible to get experience in this field. And many people don't beeline trying to, they beeline trying to get a job, understandably. And so the result is, I think one reason limitations could lead to better video games is that it gives the game designer more experience as they're working on the game, doing it live. Another way to look at that, though, is that it also creates more mistakes. And if you don't know how to make things good intentionally, to an extent, then what's to say that doing them in an unintended way won't be better some of the time? And again, we only see the games that, people thought were noteworthy most of the time. So games where something unintentionally became scary and people liked that, basically. Again, I'm aware that a lot of the games that Liquid is discussing are games that are like new, but from the indie scene. They're games with smaller development teams and budgets, and some restrictions, certainly, but not older games, necessarily. Though, again, I don't know if they are, I don't know if all of them are or not. I'm just saying some of these I infer, I believe are from, like, recent in history. You said Look Outside, for example, is from recent history. I'm proposing that some of these things are not technical limitations. They're more like the developer just doesn't know how to do this thing, or the team has a smaller budget and they set it up in a game engine and the game engine has a limitation that they didn't foresee and they don't have the budget to remake it a different way, so they have to do it in a janky way, or it just like doesn't really work exactly as they envisioned it, and that might end up being scarier than what they had in mind. Again, it's difficult to do that intentionally. A little bit more squidgy, having worked with a few already modern game making pieces of software. Game maker, perhaps, is the elephant in the room. I don't know. But it does come to mind. Mistakes can be terrifying, so that could be one thing. Another thing is different sensibilities about fear. Particularly, I would say that in the indie scene, the low definition horror may be correlative, not causative. This is something it might surprise you. It's taken this long for me to bring up. That is, I don't necessarily think that it's because it's low definition horror. It could just be that independently made games made by a smaller team on a tighter budget, which tend to have lower definition graphics, also tend to have certain other qualities. And one of them is that the developer can deliver their creative vision more directly. That could just be scarier. And then also, unrelatedly, it has lower graphical fidelity, which just correlates with this happening. To unpack it a little bit, I think that when you look at a game made by a large team of people and a small team of people, people tend to think of it as this game was made by a lot of people, therefore it's better. But that's worse in many ways. Many ways. And for games, I think almost always. It makes it easier to make tons of assets, or to maybe to test a lot in a certain way, to play test the game a lot in a certain way, to make a lot of music, to make a lot of game, potentially. But it means that if you have a creative vision in mind, or a psychological effect you want to impose on the player, well, you have to explain it to a lot more people, and a lot more people have to work together for it to be that, oh, this game has voice acting and these great motion captured visuals, and there's a voice director. So voice acting, you have to get the voice actor and the voice director to understand you, and then the motion capture artist has to implement the motion captured animations in a certain way, and the 3D model rigging thing that goes on there. I only know a little bit about this, but you have to communicate with them. Think about how many people you need to explain your vision to, and if one of them kind of doesn't get it, that element will be weird and will stick out like a sore thumb, and will often make things seem like really funny, contrasting with everything else being serious or something. When you have a game with less parts and less people, you don't need to explain your vision to as many people, and there are often literally just less elements that could be off and be jarring. And so I would argue it's much easier to convey emotion and storytelling in many cases, but also things like horror, you could easily imagine, when the team is smaller. It could be that a smaller team just correlates with lower definition graphics, and it doesn't actually have a whole lot to do with the fact that the graphics are lower definition, even though we just talked about 3 points why maybe it does have to do with that. Also, I want to suggest it is maybe just easier to make that part of a video game when you're working with a smaller team. I think it's broadly true that the number of people who worked on the game is directly proportional to how beautiful it looks, mostly, not always, but mostly, but then inversely proportional to how good its mechanics are. Brutal to say, but I think that it's surprising how often that will be true. If you put games on a scale, and a lot of people just rate games one way, I would encourage you, if you're interested, to do an experiment. Rate games that you play, just start with 2 ways. How good did you think just the game part was? Just the mechanics, just the things you operate and play, and the game design part, and remove everything else. Imagine that the game is split into a movie or movie elements, and then everything that would not be in a movie, like the things you manually do in the game, and then rate those 2 things. For me, disturbingly often, it's clear that making the game have a larger development team makes it a worse game, but a better piece of media in ways other than being a game. And if you make the team small and they can successfully ship a game, it's a better game, but it may suffer at being everything else. Personally, I don't care. I feel like that is an easy trade to make for me, but the market has decided that we care a lot about the things that are not strictly the mechanics, and that's fine. I like a balance too. Indeed, some of my favorite games of the last 5 or 10 years have been made by, wouldn't you guess it, medium-sized teams, balancing those 2 qualities, because there's diminishing returns. Once the game looks only so good, has just so much variety and an extensive soundtrack or whatever, and then just so many mechanical refinements, well, more only benefits it so much, and you would have gotten more of a benefit from investing in the other half. And so when a team is balanced, it's a balanced experience, and that can be nice. Surprise, you know. Just off the top of my head, I would say the Hades and Hades 2 from Supergiant. Nier Automata is a game that comes to mind. Metaphor Refantatio from Atlas is an interesting one in my mind for that. And many of these games actually somewhat famously featured some budget or time constraints as well. So they were a little restricted, but I would say they all largely were able to do what they set out to do as well. And are pretty popular. They're like, people have liked them all, but they all have on the smaller side teams for a game that competes on the global scale and with the AAA industry. Even another example would be something like Baldur's Gate 3, made by a smaller team, and wouldn't you know it, those are some spicy mechanics you got there. You know, whatever you think of their Larian's weird, like, elemental puddle homebrew where you throw crap all over the ground to, you know, make enemies have elemental effects on them. Bizarre. But reasonably balanced, in my opinion. And there's a lot of mechanical robustitude with how they implemented 5th edition's design for the combat of that game, while making a game that has a lot of scope and is really beautiful and kind of maximizes those elements, rather than having literally the most stuff. It maximizes those elements. Might I suggest that for something like horror, this means that games that have I would say that is something that benefits from having a focused team. It's not gameplay mechanics as per se, it can have to do with that a lot, but it's something that is a creative vision, an emotion, a psychological factor, and getting people on the same page about that can be tricky. I don't know, this one might seem like a stronger point. You might be thinking, Zandy, I thought this was the bad points category. That sounds like one of the stronger points. Maybe to some of you it doesn't, but I think to some of you it probably does. Yeah, I don't know though. I mean, I feel like if you make a horror game with a lot of people, though, you can sort of average out what will be horrifying to a lot of people as well. And I feel like that is what a lot of horror is. Like, I don't feel like that many horror games are that focused, basically, on exactly what kind of horror they portray. I feel like they have maybe a flavor, body horror, perhaps, or whatever. But have a variety of stuff on offer. So I'm not sure it's that necessary for the vision to be that focused. I don't know. But anyway, interesting. And then I do have one other, just like we've been taking a massive dump all over the mainstream games industry. So let's just do it again, shall we? I do think there's one more relevant point. The modern mainstream games industry is just a complete wuss. And so it's possible that they're scared of making the game scarier, that literally just would be worried that it would upset the audience, but like, that's kind of the point. And so perhaps the insane body horror in Look Outside, as you've described it, is just something that they're shying away from in some of the industry. Immediately a lot of you will say, okay, yeah, like, you've burned the industry rightly, but this point is just obviously wrong, because there are lots of games from the AAA industry that have massive graphical fidelity, that are made by big teams with huge budgets, that are quite body horror focused, for example. Yeah, I don't know what specific thing it would be, just to say that I do think the modern big budget games industry has been very gun shy about covering, like, anything weird or uncomfortable. And so I'm just something that feels related to this subject. Okay, it's one of the weaker points. I think that is relevant in some way. So there you go. That's 3 maybe okay guesses at what's going on, and 3 less good guesses about what's going on. Is probably that stuff. I I don't know. I would really like to play a game with more like horror I enjoy. I don't know. Not to get into it too much, because I don't think I have that much interesting to say about this specifically, which is why I didn't make the whole parlay about the subject. But I think part of my lack of enjoyment of horror has nothing to do with horror. It's just I am currently, like, exhausted and anxious, and I'm working on eliminating those things as described at the beginning of the parlay. And so naturally I'm not going to want something that kind of pulls plucks the strings of those feelings. They have been overplucked quite enough already, you know, and that it would be interesting to investigate that with horror. That being said, I know a lot of people who feel that same way, and they like horror stuff because it's sort of I have a friend like this, and he's expressed it as it sort of draws that feeling out for him. It sort of lets him unwind the plucked string. I don't feel that way. I feel sort of unpleasant, like not excited, scared, just sort of exhausted when I experience a horror thing. If there's tension, if I feel scared, which I could maybe find interesting, I'm not like completely baffled that people like that at all. I think the reason I don't like it is largely because it just physically feels bad or is almost unhealthy for my body right now. Not because I am diametrically opposed to its merits as a form of entertainment. I mean, in whatever, by the way, like I don't think it's weird or bad if other people enjoy it. I wonder to what extent I will enjoy it in the future. It's always been kind of a less interesting genre or type of entertainment for me. So it was interesting to speculate on. Certainly, I would say maybe a caveat to all of these points is like this is a quite outsider perspective on the subject. I'm trying my best, certainly compared to someone who has like specific tastes in the games industry. I do think I better retain things about genres I don't know that much about, but like not great. You know, I barely know what these games are, so you know, cut me some slack. But also seriously, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I don't know, and I don't mean to harshly judge any game all of you like. It doesn't matter what I think about it, you know. But at the same time, I don't mean to come at it with hatred. No, that is reserved for the big budget games industry, which I largely think is basically just a giant sinkhole wasting tons of money and accomplishing absolutely nothing. But be that as it may, go forth and judge some horror games with these tools in mind. With this, it's dangerous to go alone. Take these. And those are my reasonings. Folks, if you'd like to get your own parlay like this one, we'd love to have you. Ask about whatever you like. I really liked this prompt. It was an interesting one where it can be fun to have something I'm pretty confident and ready to say, but then also take some time to speculate. And I think it being a very focused prompt lended itself to that approach. So well done, Liquid. I just think this is a cool prompt. I often compliment the prompts that we get here, and I worry that comes across as, well, I do make money off of this for a living, and so I mean, it's not that efficient of a way to make money, but I like doing these. I wouldn't do them if I didn't want to. I invented this thing. Like, I wouldn't do this if I didn't like it. But I try to be specific. Like, what did I like about this? Hopefully you will believe me when I say, yeah, I think this is a cool kind of prompt. And you did a good job noticing there was this sort of odd or unintuitive thing happening in an area of the games industry, horror, that you were interested in. And then you thought, huh, like why did these not work in a way these did? Is it because of the definition of the graphics? And I think that's a good hypothesis, while also not being a monopolizing hypothesis. For example, you took care to mention that a lot of the titles that have worked better for you were more indie titles to an extent. And so could that be what's going on? Maybe a little, I suggested. I thought it was a good prompt. If you want to do your own, you can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you submit whatever the hell you want. Looking forward to the next one.